How's it going, you guys? It's Scott with Everyday Home Repairs. Now, I've wanted to do a garage epoxy coating for some time now, especially at my home, because the coating that was put down originally is just in terrible shape and completely needs to be redone. I have the opportunity here at one of my rental properties to go ahead and do a kit on this floor to get some experience. Now, I'm going to use the most common DIY coating kits that are out there. With the epoxy shield from Rustoleum, this is the most common one you're going to see at the big box stores, but we're going to compare that side by side and do half of the flooring in the upgrade to the Rustoleum kit, which is their rock solid version. Now we're going to walk you through the complete process and kind of do some pros and cons along the way so you have the information you need to make a smart decision for your own home. But also I'll be showing you, I want to go with a higher end material than even either one of these kits, but I want to be able to compare that baseline of the Rustoleum product to what ultimately I want to do at my own home. So we'll also touch on that comparison a little bit later on. But let's jump into it with the first steps, which is going to be cleaning and prepping the floor. And arguably, this is the most important part of the project to make sure you get the results you want and they hold up for years and years. And then one thing you'll want to do is a moisture test. Now I did this a couple weeks back, so I know this floor is all good to go, but you just take a clear piece of plastic, nothing fancy, and go ahead and tape that down to your bare concrete floor, which will then trap in if the concrete is releasing any moisture. You're gonna then remove it after 24 hours and you'll find moisture on the backside if you have moisture releasing from the concrete. That would cause you some issues. You might have failure right away, or at least need a specialty type of primer to prime your concrete prior to going into the next steps. So just check that to make sure your concrete's ready to go and you don't have a moisture problem. Now for most of you guys, a huge first step is just getting everything out of your garage so you have a clean floor and you're not working around anything. You need everything off the floor. For me, it's very easy. This is an empty rental. Once you get that, now I take a floor scraper and I go around addressing any problem spots like this where I have gunk or grime. Often that might be paint, drywall mud. You just want to address any of those and scrape them off the surface so it's very easy for us to either take a broom or a leaf blower like this and start to blow all of that or sweep all of that debris off the surface so we can move on to our next step. Now we need to move on to the degreasing step. And I'm just using the 1 gallon of the cleaner degreaser from Rustoleum. Check the links in the description for the exact type of products we're using in this video for your reference. If you have really soiled areas, a lot of us are gonna have oil spots and those are gonna be something we really need to address, or it's gonna be hard for that epoxy to hold on. That is one of the most common points of failure. You could go directly on with the concentrate, but usually you'll take this 1 gallon bottle, put it in a bucket, fill this 1 gallon bottle up with water, and then put it in the bucket. So you're gonna dilute it with a 1-to-1 mixture of the concentrate and water. Then you're gonna use your hose to wet down and kind of spray off after you brush in the degreaser and really work it into the surface. I have a 12-inch hard bristle brush here that works really good for this. So you're gonna wanna work that in and try to break up all that degrease and just surface coating. And then you'll go ahead and clean that off with your spray nozzle, maybe a pressure washer if you wanna go that route, but I'm just gonna use a spray nozzle for this one. Now I don't have any overly soiled areas, so I'm just doing the 1-to-1 mixture. So I'll fill this one up with a gallon of water, dump that in, and then that's what I'm gonna use on the entire floor for this garage. Wet it down a little bit and then start spreading out the degreaser. And here's where you're gonna put in the work, right? You have to use that hard bristle brush and really cover every inch of this floor, working that degreaser into the floor. This step and the next step are the most critical parts of prepping that floor so we can get a good bond with the epoxy and give it the best chance for standing up long term. So we'll go ahead and use a combination of the hose. You could use a pressure washer, and a squeegee is super handy to pull the degreaser itself and water off of that surface. And you'll probably have to do like I did here, multiple rounds to get all of it off the surface. So now we're moving on to etching. And what you're going to take is this package of granules and mix that into a plastic 2-gallon watering can. I have 1 gallon in there. I'm going to cut this open, add that, and then add the other 1 gallon. This is going to make a mild citric acid, and that's what you're going to spread evenly on the wet surface. Make sure your surface of your garage is wet and you have all that degreaser all washed off. There's no residue left behind. I'm gonna do half and half, so I'm gonna do one side, make sure it's wet. I'm gonna add half of this, 2 gallons, so 1 gallon of the mild citric acid, scrub that in vigorously with the bristle brush, and then I'm gonna rinse that off. I'm gonna kind of use my hose as a little bit of a water block here midway to wash that off, and then I'll do the same thing. I'll spread out the rest of the gallon and etch this side, scrubbing it out and then rinsing it off, and then we'll be done with etching. But just make sure you don't let the etching dry on the surface. You do want to rinse that off. So that's why sometimes we'll break it up into multiple parts, and that's why I'm doing the 2 different halves. Now you do want to make sure these granules dissolve completely. So once you put the water in, you might want to shake it around a little bit and just make sure you're not hearing any granules or clunking around in the bottom to make sure it's all the way diluted in that water. Then you'll go ahead and sprinkle that on the surface and do your bristle brush, working that in and trying to get as good of a coverage as you can. This is a critical step, the etching for this surface, to be able to bond to either the primer you're using or straight to the epoxy. And then you'll go ahead and rinse that off and use a squeegee just like the last step. All right, so I have everything dry, and for the 24-hour dry time period, I actually ran a floor fan and moved that around a few different times. And I ran a dehumidifier, and I emptied that bucket twice with the garage door closed. I was pulling moisture out of the air in the room to try to go ahead and get as much of that water out. Do not rush this part of the process. I know you might be trying to get this done in a weekend, and if we look at a timeline right behind me, that's gonna be a little bit challenging. So taking a look at the timeline to give you a better idea so you can plan. Right now for cleaning, that was the degreaser and etching the surface and moving everything out. I'm putting down 4 hours. Remember, for you, moving everything out of your garage, that might take 8 hours alone, and then degreasing and then etching. So just adjust accordingly. I'm saying 4 hours. Now, because we wetted the surface, soaked the surface down, we need at least 24 hours for dry time. And I say 24 hours dry time if you have a fan running and if you have that dehumidifier pulling out that moisture in the air. And again, I did close the garage door depending on the humidity outside, trying to keep that out and try and pull the moisture out of the air inside the garage to try to get the concrete as dry as possible. If you rush this step, you're gonna trap moisture underneath any coating, including the epoxy that you put on top of that. That would be basically guaranteed failure within the first year. It's gonna start bubbling up and loosening up, and it's just gonna start peeling off. So do not rush this step. Now we're gonna move on to patching your cracks that you might have in your surface or any sort of little chips or divots that you have. How do we patch those? That's gonna be a minimum drying time of 8 hours depending on what product you use. The product I'm going to use will be an 8-hour dry time. So I will keep building out this timeline to the completion of the project, and then you can make those small adjustments to the timeline to account for the differences in your own project. So let's jump into patching. Now I'm super fortunate. This is actually the only crack that I have in this concrete, and it is a hairline crack. Now that does propagate from outside, kind of the approach coming into the garage, and my garage door comes down right here. So I will be doing an epoxy coating on this lip. I want to open this up just a little bit more, and how I'm gonna do that is just with my angle grinder and a diamond wheel here, where we'll just cut down about 1/8 of an inch following that crack. Now I'll open it up slightly, and then I'll be able to get my epoxy filling inside of this, which I think is much better than any sort of concrete patch. Once we get this one done, then I'll show you how I'll also fill some divots with that same material. So we'll take our angle grinder in one hand and then have that shop vac picking up any of the dust and debris that will be kicking up. You want to keep this as clean as possible so we don't have to go back through and clean a bunch afterwards. So that is what the hairline crack looks like once I open it up. And here's those little chips or divots. I marked those with blue painter's tape, and you can see I have the rest of those that I need to fill with the epoxy. So when I mix it up, I know exactly where I'm going to be going. Before that, make sure you use a wire brush and just loosen up any loose concrete. Everything needs to be solid, and then you'll pick that up with your shop vac. Specifically on your shop vac, don't forget you want to make sure you have a bag in your shop vac and also the correct filter. There's filters made for drywall dust and concrete dust, which is super important if you want to keep suction throughout this process. If you have a normal filter, it'll plug within minutes. Now to fill that crack and also those chips, we're going to use the Rustoleum concrete patch and repair. I'm trying to be fair and use all Rustoleum products for this actual application. It's 2 parts of that part B and then 1 part of the part A. Then you'll start mixing it together, and it's fairly rapid setting, but you'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of workable time before you'll start feeling the consistency hardening up, and it might be a little bit harder to spread. Now once it's fully mixed, I'm going to apply it. You can either use a 3-inch or 6-inch. I just have some plastic cheap putty knives here. I'm going to use the 3-inch to put the epoxy within this crack and also the chips. So I just work along and then start to smooth that out. I'm going to grind this surface. If you are not going to grind the surface, you probably need to spend quite a bit more time smoothing it out, because your final finish, the smoothness, will show through the epoxy floor coating. So take your time if you're not going to grind. For me, I'm not making it perfect because I'm going to come back through and smooth everything out. And then I'll do that same thing for the chips, just applying a little bit, not making it perfect, but just smoothing that out, and then come back through with a grinder. I'll be using a 4-inch angle grinder with a diamond cup wheel to now smooth out the surface where we applied the epoxy. Now this epoxy is set up, it's been drying for 14 hours. It's a little softer than I would like, so we'll see how that surface grinds down. Hopefully it doesn't smear it. There are superior products out there, and I've actually used those in another video where we had a much larger gap. So if you have larger cracks or gaps in your concrete, check out the link in the description to that video. It's superior product. It sets up really fast, but it is rock solid, and it's been holding up great since that project. Now, if you don't have an angle grinder, and specifically with this shroud, you can check a link in the description. They have them on Amazon for pretty inexpensive, or you can run over to Harbor Freight and get that so you can connect up your shop vac and reduce the amount of dust and debris we're putting in our room. We've already done the cleaning, we've already done the etching, we need to do some grinding here, so we don't want to make everything dirty again before we do our final cleaning and start to apply the actual epoxy coating on both sides of this floor. So grinding off, and you'll grind off this extra epoxy, but you can also grind any other problem spots on your floor. Technically, the professionals, the way they prep the floor is a complete grind. So remember, we're going to do that on a future video, so you can check the link in the description. We'll finish up this hairline crack here and then move on to each of those small chips or divots and just do a similar grinding off to smooth everything out. So now it's pretty much go time for putting down the coating. A few things. You're going to do a light cleaning again and get all that leaves and debris that have come onto the floor since we've been doing our grinding and our patchwork. And also I'm going to put down some painter's tape at the approach to the garage where I want a clean line. So I'm going to bring the epoxy right over the lip when I'm applying that. Remember, I'm doing 2 different products. So I did put some blue painter's tape right down the middle of the garage. Obviously, you're not going to have that on your own project. Just a word of caution, the blue painter's tape will kind of glue to the epoxy. So within about 24 hours of dry time, I'm going to come back through with a razor blade and cut that blue painter's tape off before the epoxy is fully set up. Let's go back to our timeline. So we already got to 8 hours for our patch, and then we had a couple hours for grinding. Now you're going to apply your epoxy coating, and that's going to take dry time of 72 hours or 3 days. So if you started Friday afternoon, cleaning everything out, getting your degreaser, doing your etching, then you're going to dry until Saturday afternoon, and then you're going to start your patchwork, and you need some time for that to dry, the epoxy to dry. So Sunday morning you're going into grinding, cleaning everything up, and then you can apply your epoxy and get it done within a weekend. Now that's a pretty aggressive timeline for most DIYers, but then you're still gonna have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of dry time before vehicles would return onto your garage. Now, Rustoleum is very inexpensive and it's the most popular, but there are many people that report challenges, and we did a poll to our audience and got over 400 people that have used this product to respond on how long the floor lasted before it started peeling or chipping, and the results are not great. Let's go ahead and take a look. So we did 4 different buckets that the audience could choose from. Less than 1 year for chipping and peeling, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, more than 5 years. So you can see almost 1/3 of everyone said less than 1 year they started to see chipping and peeling. That's unacceptable. This is a big project to take on if you're just gonna have damage coming within 1 year. Don't forget, we're going to do an ultimate test at the end to see, can this actually hold up to hot tire vehicle, and especially turning those tires on both of the products we're using. So we're gonna test that out to see what our own results are. 1 to 3 years, another 26%. So a majority of the audience made it a max of 3 years. And then 3 to 5 years, 16%, over 5 years, 26%. From the comments, and you can check the community tab on our YouTube channel, you'll see the comments. There's a bunch of them out there. A lot of these people seem to have it done in a workshop or something without vehicle traffic, without any heavy traffic or loading. So maybe that's why a quarter are going over 5 years. So this is just for your own expectations. And I will direct you, and I will do a project with a superior prep process and also superior product, which should actually last many more years past even this top bucket. So we'll start off with the epoxy shield, and I'll break that internal seal to the bag, and then this mixes the part A and part B. Now it will start to activate. You have about 1 hour of pot life of working time with this product in the bag. So I'll pour it into a painter's tray, and I'll start to go to work with a paintbrush, just cutting in the outside edge. I have an expansion joint between the cinder block foundation wall and then that separately poured garage floor. So I'm just gonna go right up to the expansion joint. For you guys, you might wanna get the epoxy up onto that cinder block. You'll just need to have your plan in place before starting. So each one of these sections I am breaking out, and I'm doing each portion in about a 5 foot worth of the length of the garage at each time. You don't wanna go too far, because you don't want to let the epoxy set up too much on the floor before applying the flake. What I noticed using this 3/8 of an inch nap roller is the product does go on a little bit thin for the epoxy shield, so you might have to go back over to make sure you have good covering, and you'll see that if you see the color of the stains and the floor itself coming up through the epoxy shield. Now once you get it fully applied, then you'll pick up that bag of flakes you see in the lower right-hand corner. And for the epoxy shield side, I do a pretty light flake. I only use about half the amount of flakes they give you. And then on this other side where we use rock solid, I use about all the flakes that they give you. So you'll see the difference in distribution. And then leave about a foot or so to the next where you don't put much flake, and that's gonna help you blend that in when you're tossing the flakes out. There's no perfect technique in spreading the flakes. You'll just toss them up in the air and then kind of let them randomly scatter. You don't want to do a light flake and then a large concentration. It does stand out a little bit. So this is our second run, and again, this is about 5 feet at a time that I'm taking on, and then I'll go ahead and flake again, blending that in with the previous. And you can see those difference in colors as it starts to set up. Now this is the third of 4 stripes we'll be doing on this side, and the wind is starting to pick up outside. I want to keep the garage door open, but it's about 30 to 40 miles per hour outside, so we have leaves and sticks that really want to get in the garage, which is never fun when you're doing epoxy coating. And then I'll dump in the rest of that. I could have went a little heavier on the epoxy shield. I did have a little extra product. It comes with 2 bags, so I'm just using 1 bag for this 500 square foot garage. And then I'm gonna cut in that lip right now, making sure I get good coverage right on that front lip, because that's gonna take a lot of tire traffic, so you wanna make sure you have good coverage of the epoxy at that point. Again, looking out for sticks and leaves, making sure I pick any of those out before I get to that part of the floor. And then I'll close that garage door as soon as I possibly can to make sure we don't have any issues. And we'll just finish this side up with the epoxy shield. Got a little bit there on the approach, but nothing too major. And we'll flake the rest of it. And I'll end up with plenty of extra flakes just because we did a little bit lighter coating here. Now moving on to the rock solid. This is supposed to be the better product. It costs a little bit more. And this one actually calls out to just lay down those ribbons like you just saw me do. And now I'll take those ribbons and I'll kind of cut in the edge and go up and around this step here. What I'm noticing right away, and this comes with a foam roller you can see sitting on that lawn bag, is it's much thicker. It just is a thicker coating. It's staying on the surface much, much thicker than the epoxy shield. So it'll be very interesting to see how this sets up after it dries for 3 days on each. It'll be interesting to see how it looks once it's fully cured. I do like how this rock solid compared to the epoxy shield spreads. I think it spreads much easier and you're not going back and forth trying to get enough product down because it really spreads at a much thicker coverage than you saw with the epoxy shield. Now it's going to be a little bad camera angle as we start to paint ourselves out of the garage, but I'm doing the same thing. So this is my second, a little heavier flake on this side. We'll do our third of 4 and kind of paint that in. Again, I think this goes down a little bit faster. So the epoxy shield for that half took about 40 to 45 minutes. This only took about 30 minutes or so. Obviously you're learning a little bit as you go, but the coverage and just, it was a little bit easier to put down. So again, you can see that wind howling, the tree branches moving around, which adds an interesting dynamic. But I'll go ahead and finish off this edge, doing that front edge again, making sure I have good coverage because that's where your tires are going to hit. And we are going to test this floor here in just 1 minute to see, at least right away, can it stand up to some of the tests that usually will chip or peel a floor. And then we'll lay down that final flake and have both sides completed. So after applying both different products, the epoxy shield and the rock solid, if I had to pick a winner, I would say the rock solid. I like how it went on thicker. It was easier to get the coverage you were looking for. It did use a little bit more product. I would say this is going to be pretty close on 500 square feet. So you might want to get the additional kit just in case you do not want to run out of product. But I think it is worth the extra money, at least in terms of the initial look. It has a gloss finish, and the chips actually sink down in that gloss finish much, much more than the epoxy shield, which almost looks a little bit more like the paint. And it has some parts that have a gloss and then some parts that have just a dull finish. It looks like maybe the inconsistencies of the concrete itself come up through that. So it kind of has an inconsistent sheen across the floor. Now, overall, my main concern is with the prep of these type of products. I do not like wetting down the concrete and saturating everything, and etching is known to kind of have failure points over the years. And it might not actually be the etching, it might be moisture coming up through. Remember, we did not grind down the concrete flooring. So any professional epoxy coating is gonna shy away from water and is gonna go for a full grind across the floor. So keep that in mind, and that is something I'm looking to do in the very near future. Now, I did put this to the test a little bit. One, I took an appliance, I took an electric range, and I took it out on each side. I pushed it across, like dragging appliance across the floor, which is a somewhat common application for your garage, to see if it left any more than scuff marks. I really did not want to see chipping or any permanent damage. And overall, both the rock solid side, although the rock solid had scuff marks and maybe a little bit of damage to the top surface, and the epoxy shield also had a little bit of scuff marks, there was no permanent damage, no peeling or chipping. And then I wanted to run a test where I drove the new addition to the family, which is the Tesla Cybertruck. It's a very heavy vehicle, over 3 tons, and I wanted to do a hot tire test. Now, that day it was raining cats and dogs, so I had to pull the Cybertruck in and recruit some heat guns to try to dry off the tires, dry off that area, and also heat the tires to 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a common temperature your tires can get to in the summer. A common failure point for these DIY epoxy floors is when the hot tires go on and peels off the epoxy. So what I wanted to do is get that hot spot down to the surface and then do a couple left to right steering sweeps. Again, it's a very heavy vehicle. Now, I did hear some moisture. I heard some squeaking in there, so we didn't get all the moisture out. But once I backed the Cybertruck out, again, there's just scuff marks. There's no permanent damage. So overall, at least as it stands now, we have a good adhesion between the epoxy and the concrete floor. Now, when we polled the audience, about a third of people said their floor started chipping within the year. So I think the prep work, soaking that floor, not letting it dry, that's a big mistake. Make sure you're letting it dry. Possibly, depending on what season you put it down, compared to moisture throughout the year, maybe you start to get some moisture through your concrete. And since we didn't use primer and anything to kind of encapsulate that, maybe that also leads to bubbling and chipping and why these can fail so early. Now, I'm going to use the same floor and I'm going to go up several notches. I'm going to do a complete grind to the floor, getting that down to bare concrete and prepping this more of the professional standard, and also using professional materials, which is a much thicker epoxy coating, a thicker flake, and also a top coating. Just know for even the Rustoleum products, you can't get anti-skid powder that you could mix with a clear top coat that could help the durability and also make it not as slippery when it's wet. So you can look in the description, you'll see links to all these products for your reference. And then if you want to see that next version, that professional grade epoxy floor that should last well over a decade, check out this video right here. And if you have those larger cracks in your floor, you need a little more direction, you're going to check out this video right here where I patched up one of our other homes that had a much larger gap within the garage floor. So thanks for joining me on this video, and we'll catch you on one of those next ones. Take care.